Hi, I'm Alex Kliment, one of the writers of GZERO Media's global politics newsletter, which is called Signal, and I'm guest hosting the podcast this week to highlight a special project that GZERO has done on the global impact of the U.S. election. In less than 2 months' time, voters in the United States will go to the polls in an election that could reshape American life for years to come. But in the stark choice between President Donald Trump and his Democratic challenger Joe Biden, Americans will also be choosing a leader who will oversee the world's biggest economy, command the world's most powerful military, and govern a country that still has unparalleled global reach in commerce and culture. As a result, the impact of the election will reverberate far beyond American shores. But how? Here at GZERO, we wanted to understand better the global impact of the US election. So we did something simple. We asked. Over the course of several weeks in August, my fellow Signal writers and I called up prominent local journalists and commentators in 24 countries around the world and asked how the US election drama is playing out where they live, how the Trump presidency has affected their country since 2016, and what they expect to come next after November 3rd. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to listen to some of those voices with you and provide some light context and conclusions about what we heard. And to do that, I want to introduce my colleagues from the Signal newsletter who carried out this massive project and brought it to life.
I'm Willis Sparks. I write for Signal, and I work for both GZERO Media and for its parent company, Eurasia Group.
I'm Gabrielle Dubinsky. I'm a writer for the Signal newsletter, and I work for GZERO Media.
Hi, I'm Carlos Santamaria. I'm also a writer for Signal and for GZERO Media.
Welcome to Podcast Land, guys. And I should note, actually, that this is the first time that the writers of the Signal newsletter have done a podcast of any kind. So for our devoted subscribers and future subscribers, this is what our voices sound like. But enough about our voices. I want to jump into what we heard from around the world. And to start, I want to listen to a montage of some of the answers that we got to our first and most basic question, which we put to all the journalists we talked to, which was, do people in your country care about the U.S. election? And if so, why? Let's have a listen.
My name is Junko Tanaka, and I'm the former Washington Bureau Chief for NHK Japan Broadcasting Corporation. We are interested in the outcome of the election because we understand that American society is so polarized now. We're interested in where the center of the gravity in the US society and which direction it is shifting, because that can have an enormous impact and ripple effects throughout the world.
My name is Promit Palchodhary. I'm the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, a newspaper based in New Delhi. America issues more visas to Indians than they do to any other country in the world other than Mexico. And now you had a president who was actually saying that, well, I don't really care what about anything about that.
My name is Fyodor Lukyanov, and I'm editor of Russia in Global Affairs magazine.
This impact will be huge anyway, but not in the sense of bilateral relationship. As I said, bilateral relationship is quite hopeless. But the impact which U.S. policy will have on a general atmosphere in the world.
My name is Althea Raj. I'm the HuffPost Canada Ottawa Bureau Chief. Actually, what goes on in the United States is a real focus of most Canadians. Canada is incredibly dependent on the U.S. 20% of the country's GDP is based on exports to the U.S. market. It is something that figures nightly on the news here.
My name is Negar Mortazavi. I am a journalist and political commentator based in Washington, D.C., and I mostly cover Iran, Middle East politics, and U.S. foreign policy towards the region. So the result of this election, whether Trump stays or Joe Biden, is going to have massive impact on Iranian. So if, let's say, President Trump does not win the election and Joe Biden comes in as a Democrat, he's promised to re-engage with Iran, return to the nuclear deal, and basically reverse the Trump policy. That is going to have a major effect on Iranian economy, So if President Trump's maximum pressure policy continues, the hardliners who are the ones championing, tensions and confrontation with the West, with the US, the Death to America camp are going to be even stronger in Iran, and they're going to have the upper hand to weaken and eventually isolate the moderates. It will have a major impact on the upcoming presidential election in Iran and basically set the stage for almost the next decade.
My name is Samuel Getachew. I'm based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I'm a journalist with the Reporter newspaper. I think people are beginning to see it as a referendum, not just for the interest of the US, but for the interest of the whole world.
Willis, a number of these interviews were yours, and I'm curious what jumped out at you first about how and why people are watching the US election.
I think what struck me initially is that there are a lot of policy concerns. There is awareness of what's going on in the United States. There's also this kind of intense curiosity about which way the U.S. electorate is going to swerve next. Are they serious about this move toward Donald Trump, or are they going to abruptly change direction again and redefine the U.S. role in the world all over again?
And it's not just about policy. There's something else going on. Gabrielle, I know you had a thought about the ways in which there's sort of practical considerations about how the election turns out, and then some other things. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it became really clear early on, speaking to this really interesting group of people, that countries are very focused on what the outcome will mean about, or what will happen in terms of their bilateral relationship and how that will translate into immigration policy, into trade relations, into economic policy. But there's really this concern with, what will America's place be in the world after the 2020 election? And then how will that impact the global order in a broader sense?
So one of the reasons that there even is this pressing question about what the global order might look like now is, of course, that when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, he immediately set about upending decades of assumptions about America's role in the world, about the nature of America's relations, not only with adversaries, but even with allies. And so the second question that we put to all of the journalists we spoke to was, when you look back on 2016 and think about everything that's happened since then, how did Trump's election change things for your country? Let's have a listen.
Oh, it shook everything up. If Donald Trump had not been elected in 2016, Justin Trudeau's first mandate in government would have been very different. It would have been much more expansive, much more internationally focused. Instead, the ambitious environmental agenda that Trudeau had hoped to work with Clinton on was shelved. Everybody's focus turned to renegotiating NAFTA. It really felt like the house is burning and we have to save the furniture, and now's not the time to talk about building an addition.
So Donald Trump has basically proved the hardline argument in Iran that the U.S. is not to be trusted. Even when we go make an agreement with them, they don't abide by it.
The Republicans have, in the recent time at least, been the party of free trade and the party of immigration. And Trump basically, obviously, turned his party against both of those issues.
When Ethiopians look at the U.S., the U.S. has had a Republican and a Democratic government in the past, and you knew where they stood on in terms of the way they look at the world. But Trump is different. We've seen a different administration that's neither a Republican or Democrat. The best you can describe it as an independent government.
My name is Carlos Bravo Regidor. I'm an associate professor and coordinator of the journalism program at CIDE, a social science research and teaching university in Mexico City. And I'm also a political analyst for Reforma, Expansión Política, and Gato Pardo. I think that because of Trump, Mexico has started to have a role or a place in American domestic politics that is quite toxic and that is quite against the Mexico's national interest. But Mexico became an electoral piñata, and I think that has put Mexico in a very tough spot.
President Trump doesn't care much about the mutual benefit of the alliance mechanism. His focus is in dealing with allies is the balance sheet. So there is always this little cloud of unpredictability hanging over our head when it comes to President Trump. But we also have to understand that his stand reflects certain public opinion in the US who say they are tired of being the policeman for the world.
My name is Peter Foster, and I am the public policy editor at the Financial Times. So I think if you're the British government, like everybody, you've had to deal with the capriciousness, if that's the right word, of the Trump White House. And the British government, frankly, despite its Brexiteer credentials, which Donald Trump obviously is nominally in favour of, the British government and the British diplomatic system has struggled to adjust. I think Europe, Brussels, Paris would have been much less jumpy about Brexit, and therefore might have been more accommodating to the UK, less defensive in its negotiations with the UK. Because if you remember 2016, the referendum happened for the UK to leave the EU, and then Donald Trump won that election, that shock election victory, and suddenly, really trolling Germany, coming on and questioning the value of NATO. And it felt like there was a sort of populist revolution going on all around the world, and that Europe, Brussels felt it was the last bulwark against that, and therefore it dug its heels in really quickly.
Name Ron Derby, editor of Fin24 for once. It's the first time since maybe World War II you have an absent US. It's absent. Under Barack Obama, there was a clearness of this is the US, this is a stance on virtually all aspects. We kind of knew where the US stood. Now it's imploding. And that's what we were all watching.
Gabrielle, a number of those interviews were ones that you did, so I'm curious what jumps out at you when you listen to those voices talking about just how weird and different things have been since 2016.
Yeah, there was this perception that a lot of people and a lot of heads of state were shocked when Trump came to power, and what they had expected would be a continuation of American foreign policy was really thrown out the window. And I think a lot of countries really felt like they were scrambling and weren't adequately prepared for what was to come.
Willis, what were some of the things that jumped out for you about on this subject in your interviews?
On the subject of predictability, the two issues that I heard that jumped out at me in a lot of these interviews were trade and immigration, because these are issues that affect the lives of people in other countries in very personal terms, in direct economic terms. And there's a recognition that Trump didn't make this change on a whim, that it in fact reflects at least part of the electorate's feeling on these issues at the moment, that trade has not been good for America, that immigration is a dangerous thing. And I think those two issues in particular, trade and immigration, are areas where people are trying to understand, where is America going? What do Americans really want?
So this question of what Americans really want, where is America really going in the world, was framed by many of the journalists we spoke to as a problem, right? The unconventional and unpredictable nature of the Trump presidency had been hard for a lot of countries to come to grips with, to understand, and to work with. But we also heard from a handful of countries, in fact more than a handful, where the national governments or leaders had formed really good relationships with the Trump administration and had got a lot of what they wanted out of the Trump presidency over the past 4 years. And even some countries where Trump is personally quite popular amongst the population. Let's give a listen to some of the voices that we heard from those countries.
I'm Neri Zilber. I'm a journalist based in Tel Aviv. I write primarily for various U.S. magazines like Foreign Policy, The Daily Beast, Politico, The Atlantic, and I'm also affiliated with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Israel is often referred to as a domestic political issue in America. Arguably, America is a domestic political issue in Israel as well. So it's a kind of a binary choice whether this individual, whether a foreign politician, foreign leader, is good for Israel or bad for Israel. And so you have in the person of Donald Trump somebody who has been almost unconditionally supportive, at least diplomatically, of Israel and the Israeli government. I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say that Benjamin Netanyahu has bet a lot on Donald Trump over the past 3.5 years. The closeness of Netanyahu and Trump has really aided Netanyahu domestically here in Israel.
My name is Łukasz Warzecha. I'm a commentator at a conservative weekly called Do Rzeczy, which can be translated as To the Point. The PIS, the Law and Justice Party, was really extremely lucky to have Trump on the other side of the ocean, looking eye to eye with the Polish conservative government.
My name is Ahmed Al-Umran. I'm a Saudi journalist. I work as a correspondent for the Financial Times, and I'm speaking from Jeddah. The relationship with the Trump administration and the current Saudi leadership is different from anything we have seen before. Some of this has to do with Trump himself, his character and his style as a president. He's more transactional, he's less principled. Trump has been strongly supportive of the kingdom on many issues, pushing arms sales and defending the Saudis in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder. And they welcome the pressure from the Trump administration on Iran.
Hi, I'm Guga Chakra. I'm a correspondent for Globo TV, Globo News, and the newspaper O Globo from Brazil. Without Trump, Bolsonaro loses a bit of his narrative, of the far-right narrative that he uses now, because he can say, look, the President of the United States, he's just like me. If Trump wins, that will be a major victory for Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro will be more powerful because the voters will see this as a victory for this ideology that they see, that's the right-wing ideology that Bolsonaro, Trump, Orbán, Duda, and Netanyahu, all of them, they share. And it will be really helpful for Bolsonaro going for his re-election in 2022.
My name is Hisham Qasim, and I'm Egyptian. I'm the founding publisher of the Cairo Times. The Trump administration basically is very pragmatic about the relationship with Egypt. They're not interested in whether Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is abiding by values related to human rights, democracy, which at least previous administrations claimed they did.
I'm Camille Alamia, multimedia reporter of Rappler, Philippines.
For President Trump, they see him very like President Duterte, like, he says what he wants. And just to prove a point, like, I think many Filipino Americans, like the immigrants in the US, I talked to them and they're also voting for President Trump. So it's like they feel these are real people because they say what they want, not necessarily the right things.
My name is İpek Yezdani, and I'm a Turkish journalist. Turkish government believes that Erdogan can manage to have good relations with Trump based on his personal dialogue with Trump rather than the rules of the international relations. And, the perception is like that Turkish President Erdogan can convince US President Trump in the way that he wants to convince him. Trump, for instance, decided to withdraw from Syria, and when he withdrew the US forces from Syria, Turkish forces were able to go inside Syria. Turkish public mostly thinks that continuing of Trump administration will be more favorable for Turkey to the 2020 elections.
So a number of the interviews we just heard were ones that I had actually done. And so for me, the two things that really jump out for me are, first, there are plenty of governments out there and leaders who are perfectly happy, relieved, grateful even, to deal with a president like Trump, who is so ruthlessly transactional, whose politics are so highly personalized, who doesn't really waste a whole lot of time with bureaucratic process or diplomatic niceties, right? And it just so happens that a lot of those leaders who are comfortable with that are either authoritarian leaders outright, like the Saudis or President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, or they are democratically elected leaders who have shown a certain kind of authoritarian streak, shall we say. Certainly that criticism has been made of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. And that leads to the second thing which jumps out for me, which is that just the ways in which Trump's presidency has emboldened leaders around the world to run a little more roughshod over human rights, freedom of the press, democratic institutions. And I think, we all know that the United States' commitment to upholding human rights around the world has been far from pure or consistent over the years, right? The U.S. has supported a number of loathsome dictators and continues to do so. But I think there's something very different when you have a president in the White House who doesn't even pay credible lip service to these ideas of human rights and democracy, that opens up that much more space for other leaders around the world to behave as they please. And of course, one of the leaders who is behaving as he pleases in the sense of taking a very dim view of the importance of human rights is Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, whose drug war has been extremely brutal, but also extremely popular amongst the Philippine population. And as we heard, Filipinos in general are big fans of President Trump. Carlos, you lived and worked as a journalist in the Philippines for a number of years. How do you explain this?
Well, I would say that the admiration for Trump among Filipinos is not because of Trump. It's rather that Filipinos, and this is something that was confirmed in my interview, have a very close affinity for America, whether it's because they were a former colony or because about 4 million Filipinos live in the U.S. But in general, there's always a very wide support for whoever the U.S. president is.
So one thing we were really keen to understand in the middle of this project about the importance of the U.S. election all over the world was what is actually really important inside of these countries right now, recognizing that in almost all cases it's not going to be the U.S. election, important as it is. So we asked our journalists to tell us what the key concerns, political or economic or social, are in their countries at this moment. Here's what they told us.
I was talking to someone in Tehran, somebody from the middle class, who was telling me compared to, let's say, 2 years ago, I have gotten 10 times poorer because the value of the currency has dropped by almost fivefold. Certain families in the working class can't even afford to eat meat as much. It's become a rare commodity on certain people's tables.
Yeah, I'm Farhad Al-Aldin, based in Baghdad, and I'm chairman of Iraq Advisory Council, based in Baghdad. What's in the forefront of the Iraqis' mind, really the daily problems. Millions of them lost their jobs. There's very little economic development that's taking place. The effect on oil prices have affected the government's ability to pay salaries, and that subsequently affected the Iraqis even harder.
Well, of course, there's the problem of the Nile water and the Renaissance Dam that has been built by Ethiopia, in which the Egyptian side negotiated very poorly in the beginning stages. And now we are at risk of water poverty, and that could have disastrous consequences on the country.
My name is Camila Zuluaga. I am from Colombia and I work for Caracol TV and Blue Radio. You have to remember that in Latin America, and Colombia was not an exception, that before coronavirus, we had a social explosion. People were in the streets protesting against their governments. So we fear as well that maybe this economic crisis is going to deepen all the crises that we had before. And the social explosion is going to come anyways.
My name is Sergio
Arauz, and I'm a journalist for El Faro in El Salvador. In El Salvador, if you go out to the airport, if you go out to the bar, if you go 15 miles in any direction, you'll see the white flags that people who are begging for food have hung out on the outside of their houses. This is a phenomenon that we have not seen in a long time.
what the hell are we going to do with the children, with the students? Is this going to be a lost year? Are we at some point going to go back to normal? This is going to be a sort of problems and of a lot of anxiety.
In Turkey, to be honest with you, I think people in the rural areas, they don't much care about who is elected in the US. They don't even know the candidates, who the candidates are. Yes, I'm talking about people who follow the news, you know, who are interested in these issues or who are involved in politics.
Well, to be honest, I think that if we went to a street in Poland and if we asked people about the elections in the US, vast majority of them would not even realize that there is any election upcoming in the United States.
So back when we were first planning this project and picking the questions that we were going to ask the journalists, I remember that, Gabrielle, this particular question of what's going on in your country right now was one that you suggested. Tell us a little bit about why it was so important to include this question in the project and some of your impressions of the answers that we got.
Well, that conversation we had when conceptualizing this project was even before the pandemic had become a major issue outside of China. So it was already on my mind that there were big parts of the world, you know, Latin America had been rocked by protests over economic and social inequality, as had large swaths of the Middle East. And so there was a lot of tumult going around in the world. And then, you know, the pandemic hit in March, and I think the spill-on effects are quite intuitive and obvious. You know, speaking to Nagar, who's an Iranian expert, and just hearing about how much US sanctions have crippled the economy and how that trickles down to just normal families who are trying to put food on the table, and then now being hit by this double whammy of an economic and global health crisis, you can really get a sense of just how tormented people's lived realities are. And so I'm not surprised at all that our friend in Poland said that if you go into the street, you might find that a large percentage of the people actually aren't aware that there's an election going on in the US, because things are in such disarray and people are just struggling in such unprecedented numbers. And I think I'm glad we got to kind of reflect and incorporate that in this project.
And I would just add quickly that while it's not surprising that, you know, billions of people in the world don't care about this election, even among those who do, maybe they interpret the election as a barometer of just how intense that anger against the establishment is, because even after 4 years as president, Donald Trump, for people inside and outside the United States, still represents the anti-establishment person.
One of the big anti-establishment things that Trump did when he came into office was to immediately take a really hard line with China in a way that broke with decades of assumptions about how engaging with China economically and commercially would eventually change the Chinese political system and make it more like the Western democracies. And of course, it didn't work out that way. We asked the journalist who we spoke to how the growing U.S.-China rivalry affects their countries. This is what they had to say.
My name is Wang Xiangwei. I am the editorial advisor of the South China Morning Post. Before that, I was the editor-in-chief of the paper. It really doesn't matter, who sits in the White House after November. I mean, the China-U.S. ties will not return to the old track. In China, there is a great concern among people here that China-U.S., those two great powers, are not only heading for a Cold War, and there is an increasing worry that there could be a hot war over the South China Sea or over Taiwan. Hopefully the November election outcome will bring some calm to the volatile tides, and so that the two sides could sit down and discuss the problems.
Most important thing from Japan's point of view is that the strong U.S. presence remains in the region, because if the U.S. withdraws, it is China who will fill the vacuum and will set the rules of conduct.
Filipinos, surveys would show you that Filipinos trust the US more than China. But sadly, it hasn't translated to our government yet because our president has made the pivot to China now. They really care about that South China Sea. And now we feel like there's not much influence from the US to try to stop China from further encroaching on those maritime waters.
My name is Woo Jung-yup. I'm a research fellow at the Sejong Institute in South Korea. Many South Koreans believe that Biden administration might be more flexible than Trump administration with regard to China, even though we know that the negative view toward China is dominant within the United States.
India and China have a testy relationship, to put it mildly, over the past several decades. So for them, the U.S.-China relationship is, if anything, that it's deteriorating is a good thing as far as India is concerned. Trump, in their view, was willing to break China, literally, if you wish, in an attempt to recalibrate the relationship. Too often they felt with America was that the American officials would privately say, yes, China's terrible, and then say, but we can't do X, Y, and Z. In Trump's case, you'd say, China's terrible, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z.
China has come to Africa and to Ethiopia looking for a partnership. They're the ones that are building airports and the trains and infrastructure across the country. So, and most of them are being done with loans coming from China. And many people are worried that once the loans mature, how is Ethiopia going to pay for them?
My name is Christopher Ogumodede. I'm an editor at The Republic, and I generally cover African foreign policy, elections, government. Nigerians appreciate the Chinese relationship for what it is. A lot of infrastructure, a lot of loans, a lot of concessionary grants have been the cornerstone of Nigeria-China relations. For better or worse, a lot of people feel like that could have come from the US and has not. A lot less lecturing and a lot more partnering. But if you gave the average Nigerian a choice between where they'd rather go, and of course, this is completely unscientific. This is just my gut feeling as a person who lives in Nigeria. They'd rather go to America.
So we heard so many different things there, and I want to get a sense from each of you about what jumped out at you. The thing that I thought was remarkable in a number of the interviews that I did was that so many of the journalists and commentators we spoke to had this keen understanding that one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on in the United States now is that Washington should take a tougher line against China. And that on the basis of that, a lot of the people that we spoke to had this kind of pessimistic view that no matter what, U.S.-China relations were going to get worse in some way, but that there might be a difference between a Biden administration and a Trump administration, how they handled it. But the responses from different regions of the world were so interesting. Carlos, you spoke to a number of journalists in East Asia and Southeast Asia. What was the thing that really struck you about how they see the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I would say clearly we've learned people in Asian countries, especially those with close political or economic ties to China, are really quite worried now about how U.S.-China ties are getting really bad really fast. The bottom line for some of these countries is that Trump has been tough on China, but only on his rhetoric, while the U.S. has been largely absent from the region. And China has filled that gap, like it has filled that gap in Africa.
Willis, you did a number of the Africa interviews. What was the sense that you got on this subject?
I was struck by a theme. I think this extends well beyond Africa, where you hear people in countries, some richer, some poorer, saying, we need cash, we need investment. China has a lot of it. China's knocking on our door. This is good, but please don't leave us alone with them because we don't know what their motives really are. We don't know where this goes. The U.S. is unpredictable. China's predictability is wonderful in an economic sense, but their ultimate motive is questionable. I think the really interesting difference is in the U.S.-China rivalry itself, because I think in Africa, the view is that, a little competition between the U.S. and China can be good. In Asia, it's a bit different. There, the competition's scary because it could create a conflict that would land right on their front doors.
Yeah, certainly two very different perceptions of the U.S.-China rivalry. I suspect a lot of that has to do with whether you see that rivalry playing out in terms of investment loans versus battleships on the high seas, which is quite different. One really important question that we put to the journalists we spoke to was a simple one. How much would really change if Joe Biden were elected president? Let's listen to what people had to say.
One of the things I think they will be hoping for from a Biden White House, if it comes to that, is stability, is a reversion to familiar patterns, to consistency, to the old world as they would see it. And I think with Brexit, with the UK being on its own, the UK is going to have to be adjusting to being piggy in the middle, and in terms of trade, to having to triangulate much more actively its diplomatic relations between Washington and EU capitals and its new trade partners in the Asia Pacific. And I don't think a Biden administration suddenly solves all those problems, which are the result of the UK's decision to quit the European Union.
I don't think things will change drastically. There will be different tone, different discourse, but the bottom line is the main relations which are upheld through these pillars of defense and intelligence are going to remain the same. I don't think any American president is going to jeopardize the relationship with Egypt.
I don't think there would be a fundamental change in how the United States perceives Latinos. There will simply be a change that could lower the temperature with which the words migrant or Latino have been demonized, and the same for the implications of being Latino or a migrant.
My name is Torsten Ricci. I'm the international correspondent with Handelsblatt, which is a business daily. There's just some kind of looking back to the good old times when everything was okay, but I think people are realizing that those times are not going to come back, even if the White House has a new president in November. And this is kind of a painful process here. Germany needs to play a bigger role on the world stage, and that will have to be with more hard power than we used to have in the old times.
Obama said all beautiful and right words from the era of global leadership, while he de facto started to withdraw from this policy. But he did it in a very accurate and cautious way, while Trump started to just terminate everything in the way he used to do it. It's not because of him that US policy shifted so much. He was product of changes inside the United States and around the United States, which brought such an interesting president to the White House. And in this regard, of course, Trump accelerated enormously all those trends which started before, but he made them open, and he ceased to hide it. He started to be proud of it.
So some realism there in how people view just how much a Biden presidency would change. Willis, what are your thoughts on this? You've obviously written a lot about this beyond this project, this idea of what the U.S. role is and how it changes or doesn't. When you listen to this last batch of ideas, what jumps out at you?
That a lot of people see this election as a choice between the present, Donald Trump, or the past, Joe Biden, former vice president, traditional foreign policy person, rather than a choice between the present and future. And that leaves open the question that I raised earlier about the oscillation of power, because there are many people who will say, okay, maybe Biden wins. But what we really want to know is what Americans want, not just what the president wants. And might they just change their minds again in 2024? Might we have another sharp swerve in the other direction? What can really change in America today?
And one of the things that kept coming up in some of the interviews was how much there's a tone shift between Biden and Trump. Biden obviously a very different style than Trump, versus a substantive shift. Gabrielle, this is something that we had that came up in some of your interviews, actually, and particularly the UK one, where Peter Foster is saying, look, the UK has got problems that it made for itself, and a Biden administration might not help so much with that. What are your thoughts on this bigger issue of how much actually changes versus does not if Biden wins?
Yeah, that came up in a couple of interviews, this notion that sort of there's too much water under the bridge. And even though there's been all this discussion about Biden going back to reverting to the normal patterns of diplomacy that we saw under successive Republican and Democratic administrations in the past, that really we're living in such a radically different time. So much has happened over the last 4 years of the Trump presidency, and just in general in the global order, that things aren't just going to go back to normal, and we have to get used to that. So that was something that, to be honest, I wasn't expecting, and I was surprised to find out of these interviews.
I think that's a perfect segue, actually, into the final montage of quotes that we'll listen to. And these were answers to the question, what do people in your country still expect from the United States? Even given all of the upheavals of the past 4 years and all of the uncertainty about what comes next, let's give a listen.
The US was the paradigm for democracy. And now it's not that way anymore. The US is not what you look for to say, okay, this is how institutions should work. This is how we should deal with politics, because we have seen what things are happening here. So what we see from the outside and from Colombia, it's maybe an empire that it's going down.
Some young Brazilians, they are going to Australia and New Zealand to study English when they are 17 or 18 years old, to learn English. And when they want to go to college, they are choosing Canada instead of the United States. They're just afraid of what could happen to them if they come to the United States.
On the one hand, the collapse of a liberal world order, where Russia never found its proper place seriously, it's not such a big tragedy for Moscow. At the same time, that's quite paradoxically, in this liberal world order, Russia had a very clear agenda what to wish and what to try to achieve, the proper place inside this world order. So now it's over, and the period ahead of us will be time for very big reflection, what to do next, because the world in which Russia at least understood or believed to understand what to do, this world is over, partially due to Trump.
I mean, the US, we all grew up with it. I was a young man, but we all grew up with this ultimate superpower, right? When the US under Trump just totally goes off that stage and then left us in this lurch, okay, it encourages the worst of the rest of the world's leaders, right? It just kind of gives them license to do as they please. And that's what the US doesn't understand, for right or wrong reasons, either way. When they step away from that fold, then it's open season.
So there seem to be pretty widely ranging views on whether the U.S. is or is not still fulfilling a role that many people used to see it fulfilling. Inside the United States, there's this idea of American exceptionalism. I wonder how the American idea of exceptionalism compares with how the rest of the world sees America now. And Carlos, I know you had some thoughts on that when we were talking about this. How do you see this question of who thinks America is still exceptional and who doesn't?
I mean, in other countries, they're clearly, like Brazil, they're clearly upset about what the U.S. has turned to under Trump, to the point that they don't even want to send their kids to school there. But the question is, they still believe in the idea of America. They still believe in America as a beacon of light, as the world policeman, as a force for good. Whether that idea is still there after so many years and America's withdrawal from the world under Trump, we'll have to see, and we'll have to see if Biden can change that if he wins.
Gabrielle, how do you see this question of what's expected of the United States versus what the U.S. appears to be delivering or not delivering these days?
Something that was interesting that came up repeatedly was not only this notion of the US as the world policeman and being a force of good, but in what it provided countries where people want, quote unquote, to be given a second chance, right? Like the journalists we spoke to in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and India from memory all spoke about their diasporas in the United States and how, there was this feeling that America was really this beacon of light, because if you wanted to work hard and have a chance at a better future, you could come to the United States and that opportunity would be afforded to you. And now there's this feeling that even if your intentions are there and you want to be given that opportunity, it's not necessarily realistic and the United States isn't there for you. And I was trying to think about how to conceptualize this when I was speaking to these interesting people. And it kind of, the analogy that came up for me was almost as if like the United States is how we think of our parents. Like when we're younger, we have such reverence for our parents and we want to be like them and we aspire to achieve what they have. And they're really like this shining example. They're all we have. And then as we get older, we go through our teenage years and our early 20s, we come to realize that our parents are actually just really flawed individuals like everybody else. And we still have such affection and admiration and wanting to be close to them. But at the same time, we realize that they're far from like this perfect enigma that we once imagined. And that kind of was like the undertone of many of the conversations that I had.
And now there's like a rival parent coming down the block, right? I mean, there's, the possibility of running away from home suddenly presents itself when China's giving loans and trying to sort of establish its own position in the world. Willis, last thought from you. What do you think? Do people still want America? What do they think of America? How does it seem to you?
Well, I think beyond what people want from America, what really struck me is the absolute certainty with which the Russian journalist asserted that the liberal world order is over. I'm not quite so sure as he is, but you know what? Maybe he's right. And I think that is one important reason why people are watching the election in the United States, because while we could say that the real first anti-establishment political shock was Brexit, for a lot of people it was the election of Donald Trump 4 years ago. And I think that people are going to decide, some people are going to decide, if America chooses Trump again, having seen what he has wanted to do to change the American role in the world over the past 4 years, if they reelect him, then maybe this liberal world order really is over, and that leadership will have to come from somewhere else. And, a lot of the journalists really did talk about the election in international terms in that way.
Well, we will see what happens on November 3rd. I think...
I just want to add that I have enormous respect for Gabrielle's parents.
Yes.
My attitude toward Gabrielle's parents has not changed at all over the years.
They're going to love this.
Well, let me just say, if Gabrielle's parents were to become president of the United States, that would be a dramatic improvement over either of the candidates that we have on offer at the moment. That much is clear. But let's leave it there. We will see what happens on November 3rd. Obviously, a lot riding on the decision of the American people then, not only inside the United States, but as we have learned, around the world as well. And I keep going back to what Samuel Getachew, the Ethiopian journalist, said. This is a referendum, not just for the U.S., but for the world. I want to thank my Signal colleagues, Gabrielle Dubinsky, Carlos Santamaria, and Willis Sparks, for bringing this project to life and showing what that referendum for the world really means in so many places. And I also want to thank, of course, the journalists who participated in this project and were so generous with their time. You can read through all 24 of the interviews on our website, www.gzeromedia.com. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you there.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.